Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we're currently looking at is Not So Black and White by Kenan Malik, a tenacious, penetrating and determinedly fearless book, quietly passionate but firmly grounded, with multiple themes converging into a powerful and persuasive argument, and whose ideas I'm going to set out in two films, the first of which I've called The Invention of Race, and the second, Transcending Race. And this first film has two sections. Each section has three parts, and the first section is The Invention of Race, with parts called Positioning Malik and His Argument, The Invention of Race, and Race as Power and Politics, and the second I've called The Tangled Legacy of Race, with parts called Racialization of Old Oppressions and Hatreds, Mass Killing and Genocide, and finally White Supremacy. So kicking off then with the first of these, Positioning Malik and His Argument. And this is important, I think, because race and racial politics is not only an important issue at the centre of contemporary politics, it is also raw, powerful and deeply contested. And Malik enters this arena not simply as an academic, but as a participant with a position, which is made explicit with his very first words, where he tells us, "I cannot remember the first time I was beaten up because of my skin colour, in a Britain where vicious and visceral racism was woven into the fabric of society. It drew me into politics," he goes on to say, "but if this was a necessary first step in self-defence, it was also a journey to a broader canvas where politics is both an instrument for protection, but also a window to see beyond his own circumstance and appreciate, in his words, that there is more to social justice than challenging injustices done to me," and which he has pursued in what he sees as a very particular image of politics, of shared values and common vision, geared to making wider connections and linking to larger struggles, fostering solidarity in the pursuit of social justice. And here, in this opening, I think are the two experiences that drive this book: the experience of race and racism, and the experience of a certain kind of politics. To the first of these, the book can be seen, I think, as a contribution to the literature of race, where it came from and how it works, and to the second, it asserts, or more precisely reasserts, a vision of politics which, in his view, is best able to confront that racism. And to each of these two themes, racism and the politics best able to confront it, he brings two lines of argument. To the theme of racism, his first argument, and possibly his most original, is to claim that the invention of race and racism is, in a certain and paradoxical way, a reaction to equality, or more precisely to the equality proclaimed by the 17th century European Enlightenment, which declared as a self-evident truth that all men, no women here of course, were created equal, and which, from the 18th century onward, had become the basis for European political culture and self-identity. Before the Enlightenment, pre-modern Europe saw difference and inequality as permanent and natural. They were, as Kenan puts it, stitched into the fabric of society. But in the modern Enlightenment world, loudly proclaiming to be founded on freedom and justice, the persistence of difference and inequality seemed to question the very principle of European civilization. And this was the problem to which the invention of race was the solution, as a way to explain and ultimately to justify deep and persistent inequalities in societies supposedly committed to freedom and equality for all. And his second argument relating to race and racism is perhaps more familiar, namely that it was not, as commonly believed, race that gave birth to racism, but racism gave birth to race, which is to say social inequality came first and race was the secondary justification for that inequality. Or put differently, race is the invention of society, not the legacy of biology. And to understand it, we must understand the societies from which it came. Which, of course, brings us back to politics as the means to both understand and transcend race. And again, in this second theme, Malik offers two lines of argument. The first asserts that identity politics as a form of anti-racism is conceptually weak and strategically misplaced. It's conceptually weak because its primary categories are too rigid, or, to paraphrase the book, too black and white. They are, he argues, essentialist and hard-shelled ideas that fail to capture the complexities of social inequality. And it's strategically misplaced because it misdiagnoses the problem, undermines solidarity, and trades the politics of change for a kind of symbolic politics of gesture where demands for recognition do little to challenge the deeper structures of power, and which ironically draws anti-racism into the same black and white world of the racism it seeks to challenge. And this first argument about the inadequacy of this approach leads to his second argument, recommending, surprisingly perhaps, that we should return to the Enlightenment as a better alternative, or more precisely, the radical Enlightenment, forged and given meaning, he argues, by the non-European world, as the best foundation for an anti-racist politics, with its radical universalism more concerned, better able and more fully resourced to achieve meaningful change than what he sees as the narrow and inward-looking politics of identity. These then are the concerns and arguments that weave through this book, and in today's film the emphasis will be on the first cluster of these concerning race and racism, while the second cluster concerning the politics best able to confront that racism is dealt with in the second film. And so, with Malik and his arguments now situated, we can move to part two, the invention of race. And here, as already stated, race must be seen as the invention of a very particular kind of society, a European society soon to export itself to America, and which from the 17th century onward was not only proclaiming Enlightenment equality, but undergoing profound change, the first society in the world to experience what we call modernity, powered by science, technology and capitalism, and creating individuated societies, novel forms of manufacture, the beginnings of a new market economy, and the creation of new social forces. And which for its winners was a time of exponentially increasing confidence and power, of progress, scientific discovery, voyages of exploration, and the classification of the natural world. But it was also a time, in the words of Marx, of the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions and everlasting uncertainty and agitation. And if the Enlightenment is, as Malik claims, the immediate spur to the invention of race, it is this tumult of change and uncertainty that forms its larger landscape, emerging out of this vortex as a complex concept with multiple tasks and uses, as a medium through which the contradictions of modernity could be understood, as a way to make sense and justify the persistence of inequalities, as a new instrument for a newly emerging ruling class to divide and rule, and as a channel through which pessimism and anxiety could find expression. And central to its usefulness was its lack of definition, making it capable of being flexibly applied to individuals, nations and language groups, and equally expansive in its claim to explain all manner of things, including global trends, the inner workings of history, and especially, as it turns out, the supposed superiority of European people. This then is the context where, by the mid to late 18th century, the impulse to classification, whereby science in general and biology in particular sought firstly to place all living forms into a rational pattern of species and families, orders and classes, and secondly went on to ask how different human groups slot into these new taxonomies of nature. And so began the quest to invent race, this empty but most versatile of concepts, a quest which initially proved elusive, took more than a century to establish, saw it nearly extinguished, but today has left race still casting its shadow over our politics. As Malik has it, the more we despise racial thinking, the more we cling to it. And this journey towards the definition of race can be understood as the convergence of two very different parts, which in their very different ways gave credibility to the racial idea. The first path was scientific and the second cultural. The science-based path proved the most difficult, pursued by those who passionately believed in racial differences, but equally found it impossible to define what they were, because every measure purporting to illustrate racial distinction was subject to change over time, and therefore incapable of differentiating in any meaningful sense one race from another. A conclusion endorsed by most leading anthropologists at the time, who saw it as an abstract idea existing only in the fertile imagination of the human mind. Others, though, were less easily dissuaded, and here's how Malik describes one such thinker. When Harvard anthropologist Ronald Dixon set out to write a racial history of man, he gave up on using objective categories. Instead, he decided, in his own words, to set up arbitrary standards and, using these as our measure, determine the character and relationships of people in terms of our arbitrary selected units. To which Malik goes on, the acceptance of something that did not exist became the starting point for proving that it did. And with that, Dixon wrote a 600-page book. And it's in this inventive way that human classification began, which initially and briefly resisted giving rigid definition to race, emphasizing continuity between groups without fixed boundaries, but which over time moved inexorably from loose generalization to fixed categories, set out in various racial taxonomies, such as those of Johann Blumenbach and his successors, all variations on a theme, and mostly distinguished by the number of races included, which ranged from 3 to several dozen. And with that, anthropology, as contemporary anthropologist Jonathan Marks puts it, went down one of the blindest alleys in modern science. And the classifications these produced came through a mix of observing physical characteristics, mostly the skull, and barely suppressed assumptions of white superiority, combining to create what can only be called the systemization of prejudice masquerading as science, articulating categories not only of human type but of hierarchical value, where supposedly biological differences became gradations in a spectrum with white superiority its defining feature, all of which generated the wearily familiar and predictable distribution of human qualities, where the whites, particularly those deemed Anglo-Saxon and Teutonic, were masculine and virile, noble, serious, strong and intellectual, with an instinct for order and destined to create a new civilization, and non-whites as variously effeminate, dull, slow, foolish, childlike and crafty, with an intensity of desire and incapable of raising beyond the basic and the physical. So this then was the scientific path to race. It was strident, certain, and would become crucial to European imperialism. And although it pretty much ends up in the same place, which is to say, to make race believable, the cultural path in its origin and motivation could not have been more different. In origin, to a large extent, it can be traced back to the philosopher Johan Herder, who, Malik tells us, is one of the most influential, complex and misunderstood thinkers in the history of race, a figure horrified by all forms of imperialism, but who unwittingly laid the foundations for this second cultural pillar to give credibility to the idea of race. And Herder's argument has two dimensions. Firstly, he sees the fundamental unit of human existence as a people rooted in a single place, what he calls the Volk, each unique with its own spirit or Volkgeist, a spirit which speaks through its culture and in particular resides in its language, which for Herder bears the stamp of mind and character of the people who created it and is nothing less than its heart and soul. And if this first dimension is in many ways an attractive vision of spiritual unity, Malik finds the second aspect of his thinking more problematic, where he maintains that only when a people remain attached to the place of their ancestors can they remain whole, and only when undisturbed over time can their beauty and uniqueness flourish. A line of thought that meant Herder was implacably opposed to migration and to mixture. And this idea of unique peoples, each with its own Volkgeist, resonated with a new interest in folk culture with its stories of legend and origin, which among other things increasingly framed past conflicts in racial terms, a tale of Saxons versus Normans or Gauls versus Frankish, retold as race war, and populated with romantic myths, where the Teutons really were the noble free tribes of the ancient German forests and possessed of a race soul. And by the mid-19th century, these two paths, the scientific and the cultural, converged, which is to say, race as an invented category dressed as science, and race as an imagined idea dressed as culture, combined to finally establish race as a legitimate category in science and thought. However, having said that, by the mid-19th century, this was still only at the elite level, and whilst established, the idea of race still had to consolidate itself in a process fraught with questions, contestations, and anxieties, not least of who precisely belonged to these new categories, which were far more than simply classifications of human type, and were, much more importantly, classifications conferring power and status. Which brings us to part 3, race as politics and power. And if race is to have any meaning, it's only as a political, not as a scientific concept, whose purpose from the beginning was to distinguish rank, and long before it was invented as a scientific and cultural category, it had existed for centuries as a generalized term for the lower orders, where racial distinction was premised entirely on non-biological forms of rank, and where labourers and farmhands were considered as distinct races. Indeed, even after race was biologized through science, the poor continued to be racialized, underscoring race as both a category of convenience, adaptable, flexible, and easily applied, and a classification deeply political, whose meaning and application was tied to power. And this was particularly true for any claim to whiteness, which with the establishment of race became the undisputed badge of value. But the question of who was white remained fluid, contested, and subject to negotiation. And this was particularly true in America, home to successive waves of immigrants over the 19th century, but where only a tiny minority, the Saxons and the English, could be considered truly white. For Benjamin Franklin, Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians and Swedes were of a swarthy complexion. The Irish were considered the Negroes of Europe, low-browed and brutish, and immigrants from southern and eastern Europe were, in the words of Edward Ross, professor of sociology at both Cornell and Stanford, Caliban types, and where, among the new immigrants, were so many sugarloaf heads, moon faces, slit mouths, lantern jaws, and goose-bill noses, that one might imagine a malicious djinn had amused himself by casting human beings in a set of skewed moles discarded by the Creator. All of this meant that as the 19th century moved towards the 20th, whiteness was, in Malik's words, an uncertain terrain of disputed lines. But he goes on to say that this was rapidly transformed by two developments in Europe and America, as firstly extending the vote to the working class at home, and secondly extending imperialism abroad, both of which would bring a cascade of effects that would galvanise the politics of race. So that almost immediately, particularly in America, whiteness became solidified as fears of the not quite white faded, and groups like the Irish, now able to operate politically, would start their journey to whiteness on the back of growing political influence. And most crucially, racial thinking went from elite ideology to become part of mass culture, celebrated in mass circulation newspapers and popular entertainment, and empire and imperialism became wildly popular and at the very centre of political life. And in this context, racial science, presenting itself as a new science of man, was supercharged by the distorted and selective pillaging of Darwin, more or less exactly when European imperialism came to its frenzied peak in the scramble for Africa. Of course, Darwin's 1859 Origin of Species, Malik tells us, did more than any other scientific development to undermine the concept of race, comprehensively contradicting its claim for race as a fixed and unchanging essence. But in the late 19th century, the politics was more important than the science, and instead self-styled racial scientists and opportunistic politicians took its two central metaphors of progress and struggle to create an imperial narrative par excellence, where progress was told as a story of humanity's journey from savagery to civilization, in a series of stages where Europe was the journey's end as the triumph of civilization, and so-called savage societies remained stuck at its uncivilized beginning, while struggle was the mechanism pushing all of this forward, coded as the survival of the fittest, presented as necessary for human advance, and ultimately conceived as race war. And it's from this brew of race posing as science and racial science posing as the moral destiny of humankind that ideas such as John Beddoes' 1885 Index of Negrescence became acceptable, which claimed to quantify the degree of blackness in a population as a measure of backwardness, which he translated into a mathematical formula and a racial map, showing the Irish, Welsh and Highland Scots as more Africanoid and therefore backward, and locating the Irish in particular as close to the prehistoric Cro-Magnons. Or the earlier ideas of Robert Knox, whose 1850 The Races of Man argue that since all history is a history of race war, the strongest races must defeat the weakest, and in such a war, the aim of the Saxon is the extermination of the dark races of men. Or there's the later ideas of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose 1899 Foundations of the 19th Century Malik describes as a synthesis of racial history, race war, folk psychology, Aryan myth and eugenics, arguing that the Germans and the Jews were the only two pure races left in the world, and the intent of the latter was to infect Europeans with its blood, while the vocations of the former was to found a completely new civilization. And all of this was unfolding against the backdrop of an age, as characterized earlier by Marx, as the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions and the everlasting uncertainty and agitation, an age of conflict and revolution, of pessimism and of profound anxieties about the upending of tradition, the unstitching of hierarchy, and the empowerment of the dangerous classes. And for all its talk of superiority, there was also dread for its own racial stock, of the darkness within, of the homegrown barbarian gnawing away at the gains of civilization. All of which fueled in reactionaries the counter-Enlightenment and in moderate liberals growing fear, and again, race was the channel through which this fear and pessimism would be expressed. So race, then, is not a scientific category, but a political one, potent, powerful, flexible, and a gift for the ruling elites everywhere, born of immense change and deep tensions, of claims to progress and fears of degeneration, of social Darwinism and talk of race war, of high-stakes jockeying for position and profound class conflict. And it brought to this already toxic brew a warped morality premised upon dehumanizing a vast swathe of the world's population, such that Theodore Roosevelt, in Malik's words, believed the elimination by whites of inferior races was a moral good. Which brings us to Section 2, the tangled legacies of race. And in this much shorter section, I bring together a number of themes sketched out by Malik, which only focus on Europe and America and are by necessity only small windows to a much larger canvas, chosen here to illustrate Malik's arguments about the origin of race as a product of modernity, invented to explain persistent inequalities in societies signed up to Enlightenment ideals, but which also racialized long-standing pre-modern hatreds, which brings us to part 1, the racialization of existing oppressions and old hatreds. And here Malik gives 2 examples, the first of which is the existing oppression of slavery, which has a very long history, was embedded in most world cultures, and before New World slavery was not racialized. And that was also the case for the early American plantations, worked mainly by white, indentured servants and bonded labour, and who, like the slaves who came after them, were bought and sold, treated as things, and subject to brutal and horrific treatment. Over time, however, the economics of slavery would change, and there were fewer bonded servants and more slaves. But still, for much of the 17th century, black slaves and white servants saw each other as sharing the same predicament. They ran away, stole hogs, got drunk, and even made love together. And, as already argued, this early colonial society was structured not by race, but by class. As Malik puts it, transatlantic slavery did not develop for racial reasons. The European elites would have developed a slave system utilising poor whites had it been practically possible. Attitudes to black slaves and white servants were, in the 17th century, similar. Over time, though, slavery became racialized, partly for pragmatic reasons and partly also it was necessary to justify the acceptance of servitude in a society that proclaimed a commitment to freedom and liberty. And for America, this racialization of slavery would indelibly stamp its legacy, shaping the nation's character, creating both white and black identities and producing deep pathologies that ran through its history, a history of white supremacy, civil war and Jim Crow apartheid, as well as black resistance from Pan-Africanism through to Black Power and Black Lives Matter. And if this is America's particular legacy of race, it also connects to wider legacies, in the way, for instance, that the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, when the Nazis formalised the racial distinction between Jews and Aryans as the first step to their final solution, and which was modelled on the race concepts and practice of America, which it regarded as the innovative world leader in the creation of racist law. And here, the racialisation of slavery connects to Malik's second example, the racialization of Jews. And just as slavery predates race, so did all manner of prejudice and bigotry, stitched into the social fabric and very much including the hatred of the Jews. But just as it was the modern embrace of equality which produced the idea of race, so the same Enlightenment equality transformed the pre-modern hatred of Jews into modern anti-Semitism. As Malik puts it, Modern anti-Semitism is distinct from pre-modern hatred of Jews because it is the product of an age in which the principle of equality, including the equality of Jews, had been accepted. This was an equality that came with what became known as the emancipation of the Jews in 1791, when the French Revolutionary National Assembly proclaimed their unconditional equal rights as central to its moral vision of Enlightenment equality, a vision carried across much of Europe by the Napoleon Wars of 1799 to 1815. But just as the Declaration of the Rights of Man did not wash away inequalities, so Jewish emancipation did not wash away a sense that Jews were alien to the European wider society, and their differences and the continued barriers to full participation now represented a challenge to Enlightenment equality, becoming what became known as the Jewish question, a problem of how to make sense of their difference and how they might be brought into modern society. And the answer given, echoing the way larger persistent inequalities were explained away by race, was to racialise the Jews, rerouting Jewish difference away from religion and toward race, and in so doing reconfiguring the nature of their differences, so that whereas in the 18th century Jews were seen as the tribal remnant of superstition and backwardness, by the 19th they had become its opposite, which is to say, the embodiment of cosmopolitan modernity. And it was from this same modernity that anti-Semitism was born, from the same uninterrupted disturbance and everlasting uncertainty, of rapid and disorientating industrialisation, financial crashes, recessions, speculation, unemployment, poverty, and the disintegration of old ways of life and culture. And Jews became not just a symbol, but the very embodiment of all of this, the personal representatives of uprooted and soulless capitalism. Added to all of this was the rise of racial thinking, social Darwinism, the culture of empire, and the work of Herder, whose insistence that cultures can only be authentic if they are rooted in a distinct place and with an unbroken history, which is to say, in an exclusive Volk, deepened racial thinking and of course heightened anti-Semitism, which, in Malik's words, was the politics of cultural despair and a kind of existential howl against modernity. In France, the anti-Semitism that this produced raged against the Enlightenment and its universal values, which anti-Semites believed had destroyed their way of life and for which they blamed the Jews, all of which was played out in the Dreyfus affair when in 1894, after a loyal Jewish officer had wrongly been convicted of treason, became a visceral and ferocious public debate about what it was to be French, in an atmosphere of hateful and angry pessimism where not only Dreyfus but the entire French Republic and its Enlightenment ideals were put on trial. Across the border in Germany, especially following its defeat and humiliation in the First World War, the same anti-Semitism took a different and more deadly turn, which brings us to part 2, mass killing and genocide. And here, the Nazi genocide of Jews is for many the definitive crime of race and racism, a unique, barely explicable depravity, such that, as Malik puts it, it's difficult not to imagine Auschwitz as completely alien to the human experience. But who goes on to say, yet not only were the Nazis human, so also was their barbarism, and here is another thread in the tangled legacy of race, where the preparation and template for Jewish genocide was already implicit in European colonization. Again, in Malik's words, where ideas of racial inferiority, the depravity of punishment imposed on savages, the celebration of the extermination of whole peoples, all was stitched into Western culture long before 1933. This, of course, refers to a catalogue of European barbarism from more than 2 centuries of imperialism, and speaking to this, Malik cites, among other examples, the British practice of cannonading and the obliteration of the indigenous people of Tasmania, and the grotesque kidnapping, blackmailing, amputations and mass killing of an estimated 10 million people required so that Belgium's King Leopold II could amass profit beyond measure in his perversely named Congo Free State. But perhaps it's the possibly less well-known attempt to exterminate the Herero and Namba people in German Southwest Africa and today's Namibia, which, although dwarfed in scale, anticipates the uncomplicated desire to annihilate a whole people. And this is precisely what developed in Germany after it declared the Herero and Namba homelands as their own in 1890. And for their crime of resistance, General von Trotha, the commander of German Southwest Africa, who, in the words of Malik, viewed every struggle between Europeans and colonised people as part of a global race war which could only be won through the annihilation of the racial enemy, and in 1904 they sought to do exactly that. Waiting for the Herero annual migration and their customary camp at the foot of a large plateau, a place of deep spiritual meaning and the last source of water before the Kalahari Desert, some 50,000 Herero were surrounded by 7,000 soldiers and subject to continuous artillery onslaught, while all the waterholes were cut and survivors killed on sight. Shoot, kill, hang, whatever you like, old or young, men, women or children, wrote one German soldier about his orders. However, despite these best efforts, miraculously thousands survived, barely alive, yet not dead. And now worried about its reputation, Germany moved to a policy of mass incarceration on Shark Island, in what David Olusoga described as perhaps the world's first death camp, a place where, in Malik's words, captives were forced to boil the severed heads of the dead, many of whom would have been related to them, and scrape the flesh, sinews and ligaments of the skulls with shards of broken glass, so they could be packed into crates and shipped to German museums and universities. And none of this is to diminish the scale or the unique depravity of the Holocaust, but it might be seen as a depravity built upon a series of depravities. And for all the uniqueness of their crimes, the Nazis drew upon decades of racial theory and practice. And when one can point to an American president, Theodore Roosevelt, describing the extermination of Native Americans as moral because their lives were but a few degrees less meaningless, less squalid and less ferocious than the wild beasts, and when the Nazis borrowed directly not only from American race law, but also from its so-called model law for sterilising the feeble-minded, Malik suggests that what is perhaps most unique was the zeal with which the Nazis conducted their killing and the willingness to import colonial practices into the heart of Europe. As Amy Césaire, quoted by Malik, puts it, before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimised it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Having said all of this, it's important to say here that Malik takes very seriously anti-Semitism and the experience of the Jews, and just as he's willing to critique the identity politics of Black Lives Matter, he's also willing to critique what he sees as left-wing anti-Semitism, explaining, in his words, as whiteness has become the currency of anti-racism, so the tendency to ignore anti-Semitism, or even indulge in it, has become more prominent, going on to argue that there has long been a strand, albeit a minor one, of left-wing anti-Semitism, which conflates Jews with capital and finance, and can slip from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. And the Jews, more than any other group, have been placeholders for the fear and projections of others, as the embodiment of difference and an open canvas upon which the dislocations of a harsh world can be blamed. Even in racial classification, they have been portrayed as Schrödinger's whites, simultaneously white and not white, and in characterization they have been, as previously stated, variously classified as the tribal remnant of superstition and backwardness, the personification of modernity and cosmopolitanism, simultaneously the grasping capitalist and the agent of Bolshevism, and now in the era of identity politics, where anti-racism is increasingly directed against whiteness, they have come to personify the most pernicious quality of whiteness, not just white, but hyper-white, the iciest of the ice people. And this connects to one of the major themes in the book, that of white supremacy, as both a reality and a practice, but also as a feature of identity politics. And in this last section can be found the final tangled legacy of race in the American experience, whereby slavery produced white supremacy, and how it was able to reassert itself after the end of the American Civil War and the end of slavery, which brings us to the final part of this film, white supremacy. And it's worth saying here that this very short final section might be seen as providing context for the next film on this book, which is called Transcending Race, and considers the best means to both understand and transcend race and racism, particularly in America. And in so doing, critiques the idea of white supremacy as part of a larger critique of identity politics, arguing it's not a very useful idea around which to build a strategy of anti-racism. But here, and in many ways in tension with this questioning of white supremacy, it also asserts its reality, at least as detailed in the reassertion of white supremacy following the end of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery. And this was a reassertion made by those who called themselves redeemers, and who, in Malik's words, sought to redeem the region through the reimposition of white supremacy, took control throughout the South, pushing it into a new path, at the end of which was the construction of a system of apartheid enforced by Jim Crow laws. And this is a story of coordinated and determined will, and of political manoeuvre and the application of power, where the various agents of white supremacy, from the personal to the institutional, used all the instruments at their disposal to dismantle the system of constitutional rights given to black people at the end of the Civil War. And it began with political manoeuvre, whereby the party of white supremacy, otherwise known as the Democrats, negotiated a deal with the Republicans, whereby they agreed the Republican nominee in the disputed 1876 presidential election could be declared president if the Republicans would agree that all federal troops in the South be returned to barracks. They did, and at a stroke, removed all state protection given to freed slaves, and allowed the Democrats of the South to consolidate power and gain control over all its political institutions. Institutions which immediately set about reassembling new systems of control through a system of what were called black codes, enforced through coercive violence and implemented through state militia, vigilante terror groups and white supremacist courts. While at the federal level, and in a series of judgments, the Supreme Court emasculated all the legislation which gave black people constitutional rights and equality before the law, all of which was drowned in what Malik described as the wave of sudden racism in the 1890s that came in as a swell upon a mounting tide of national sentiment. A sentiment and a will underpinned by a level of violence scarcely imaginable, organised around a regime of lynching, where between 1877 and 1950, more than an estimated 4,000 lynchings took place over 12 southern states, not simply to kill, but as a collective experience of ritualised sadistic supremacy, public spectacles of torture, where picnics were held and lessons delayed so that children could be part of this spectacle of killing. And it's this legacy, a legacy of white supremacy underpinned by violence, which has shaped the African American political reaction, producing a diverse and at times divided set of political responses, from Pan-Africanism, civil rights and black power through to Black Lives Matter, which will be the topic of the next film. But until then, this ends this first film on Kenan Malik's Not So Black and White, a comprehensive and penetrating survey of how the empty concept of race came into existence and justified stunting the lives and the killing of so many people.